I never imagined that my life would unravel in such a catastrophic way. I had always prided myself on being a good husband, a reliable employee, and a man who had his life in order. My name is Michael Tanner, a 36-year-old sales executive originally from a small town in Ohio. My upbringing had been simple but stable, with hardworking parents who instilled in me the values of loyalty, dedication, and perseverance. After graduating with a degree in business administration, I moved to the city, driven by the desire to build a successful career and provide for my future family. That's where I met Emily. Emily was everything I could have hoped for in a partner. At 32 years old, she was stunningly beautiful, with long chestnut hair that cascaded down her back and eyes that sparkled like emeralds. She had grown up in the city, a stark contrast to my rural roots, and worked as a graphic designer for a small but reputable firm. We met at a mutual friend's party 6 years ago, and from the moment I saw her, I knew she was the one. Emily had this infectious energy, a zest for life that drew me in. Her laughter was like music, her smile capable of brightening even the darkest days. Our relationship moved quickly. Within a year, we were married, and shortly after, we bought a modest house in the suburbs. We weren't rich by any means, but we were comfortable. I was moving up the ranks at work, and Emily's career was blossoming. We were the picture-perfect couple, or so I thought. But as I stood there that fateful afternoon, my world crumbled before my eyes. It was a Thursday, and I had decided to leave the office early. I worked for a large corporation, and the stress of the job had been getting to me lately. My boss, Richard Callahan, was a demanding man in his late 40s with a reputation for being ruthless in business and charming in social circles. He had taken me under his wing when I joined the company, showing me the ropes and pushing me to my limits. I respected him, admired him even, despite his cutthroat demeanor. I never imagined that he would betray me in the most personal way possible. That day, I had a sudden urge to surprise Emily. We hadn't spent much quality time together recently, and I thought it would be a nice gesture to bring home her favorite takeout and maybe catch a movie. As I drove home, I felt a sense of contentment, a rare moment of peace in my otherwise hectic life. I parked the car in the driveway, noting that Emily's car was already there. The house was quiet when I walked in, eerily so. I remember thinking it was strange, considering Emily was always playing music or had the TV on in the background. I called out her name, but there was no response. I assumed she might be taking a nap or working in her home office. As I made my way through the hallway, I noticed the door to the living room was slightly ajar. The closer I got, the more I could hear faint murmurs. I couldn't make out what was being said, but the tone was unmistakably intimate. My heart began to pound, a sense of unease creeping in. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. That's when I saw them. Emily was kneeling on the plush carpet, her back to me, while Richard stood before her, his shirt half unbuttoned. The scene didn't register at first. It was as if my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The air in the room was thick with tension, the kind that made my skin crawl. Emily's hands were trembling as she reached for Richard's belt, her head bowed in shame or submission. I couldn't tell which. My breath caught in my throat, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. Richard was the first to notice me. His eyes met mine, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of surprise before his expression hardened into one of defiance. He didn't move, didn't pull away from my wife. Instead, he smirked, a cruel twist of his lips that made my blood run cold. I could see the amusement in his eyes, as if he were relishing the pain he knew he was causing me. Emily finally realized I was there. She froze, her hands dropping to her sides as she turned her head slowly to look at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and fear. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling, but there were no words she could say that would undo what I had just witnessed. "Why?" I managed to choke out, though the word felt hollow. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of the betrayal that was unfolding before me. "I couldn't resist his Big Johnson," Emily muttered, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, each syllable a dagger to my heart. There was no emotion in her voice, no apology, just a cold, brutal admission of her infidelity. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them both feel the pain that was tearing through me like wildfire, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls spinning as nausea churned in my stomach. Richard, however, was unfazed. He stepped forward, his gaze never leaving mine, and pulled out a Colt revolver from the inside of his jacket. My heart stopped as he pointed it directly at me. The world slowed down, the only sound my racing heartbeat pounding in my ears. "You will watch me with your wife until I finish," he said, his voice low and menacing. There was no doubt in his tone, no hesitation. He was in control, and he wanted to make sure I knew it. I couldn't believe what was happening. This man, whom I had looked up to, whom I had trusted, was not only violating my wife, but was now threatening me in my own home. A surge of anger began to rise within me, but it was tempered by the stark reality that I was staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Emily didn't move. She just sat there, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped as if she had already resigned herself to whatever was about to happen. The woman I had loved, the woman I had vowed to protect and cherish, had become a stranger in the blink of an eye. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound ever could. As Richard's words echoed in the room, a sickening realization dawned on me. This wasn't just about sex. This was about power, about domination. He wanted to break me, to assert his superiority in the most degrading way possible. And Emily, my beloved Emily, had become a willing pawn in his twisted game. The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with the stench of betrayal and fear. I could feel my sanity slipping, the edges of my vision blurring as I tried to grapple with the enormity of what was happening. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, it was an assault on everything I held dear, on my very sense of self. But as I stood there, paralyzed by shock and disbelief, something inside me snapped. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted like a volcano, scorching away the numbness that had threatened to consume me. This man, this so-called mentor, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I wasn't going to be a victim in my own home. I wasn't going to stand by and let this man destroy everything I had worked so hard to build. The time for fear was over. It was time to take control. As Richard tightened his grip on the Colt, his eyes narrowing in anticipation, I took a deep breath and prepared myself for what was to come. The confrontation that awaited would be brutal. It would be unforgiving, but it would also be the only way to reclaim what had been stolen from me. The sight of Richard holding that Colt revolver was like a punch to the gut. It was one thing to walk in on your wife betraying you with another man, but it was another level of horror entirely when that man was your boss, standing in your living room, brandishing a firearm. My mind was a storm of emotions, rage, fear, disbelief. But underneath it all was a cold, unrelenting sense of violation. This was my home, my sanctuary, and he had defiled it in the most humiliating way possible. Richard Callahan had always been a man who exuded power and control. At 48, he was the epitome of the successful businessman, with a chiseled jawline that had only grown sharper with age, salt and pepper hair that gave him a distinguished look, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. He was the kind of man who commanded a room without saying a word, his mere presence enough to make subordinates fidget and clients bend to his will. I had always respected him, even admired him, for his relentless drive and unyielding standards. But now, that respect had turned to something darker, something closer to hatred. He had noticed me first, standing frozen in the doorway, and that twisted smirk of his had only deepened when he saw the shock and devastation on my face. The way he held the Colt, casually yet with unmistakable authority, told me that this wasn't the first time he had used it to assert his dominance. It was a symbol of his power, a tool to remind others of their place in the world. And right now, he was using it to strip away any sense of power I had left. "You will watch me with your wife until I finish," he had said, his voice calm and steady, as if he were discussing business over lunch rather than threatening to violate my wife in front of me. His words dripped with contempt, not just for me, but for the very idea that I might think I could stand up to him. In his mind, this was just another transaction, another deal to be closed, and I was nothing more than an obstacle in his way. The terror in Emily's eyes as she looked at me was something I would never forget. It wasn't just fear of what Richard might do, it was fear of what I might do in response. She knew I was a man of principle, a man who valued loyalty and honesty above all else, and in that moment, she realized she had shattered everything we had built together. But her fear didn't stem from guilt or remorse, it was rooted in self-preservation. She was terrified that I might react in a way that would make an already terrible situation even worse. Emily had always been a complex woman, someone who craved attention and validation. Growing up in the city, she had been surrounded by people who valued appearances and status above all else. Her father was a high-powered attorney, her mother a socialite who spent more time at charity galas than at home. Emily had learned early on that beauty and charm could get you far in life, and she had perfected the art of using both to her advantage. But beneath her confident exterior was a deep-seated insecurity, a constant need for approval that had only intensified as she grew older. When we first met, I had been drawn to her vivacious personality, her ability to light up a room with her smile. But as our relationship progressed, I began to see the cracks in her facade. Emily was always seeking something more excitement, more attention, more validation. She loved me, I had no doubt about that, but she also needed the thrill of being desired by others. It was a need that I had tried to fulfill, but it was never enough. And now, that need had driven her into the arms of a man who was everything I despised. As I stood there, staring down the barrel of Richard's Colt, I felt a cold, creeping dread settle into the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a calculated move, a power play designed to emasculate me in the most personal way possible. Richard knew exactly what he was doing, and he was relishing every moment of it. He took a step closer, the barrel of the Colt now inches from my chest. "You're going to stand there and watch," he repeated, his voice a low growl, "and you're not going to do a damn thing about it, because if you do, I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your life." I could see the challenge in his eyes, daring me to defy him, to make a move that would give him an excuse to pull the trigger. But I was paralyzed, my mind racing with the implications of what was happening. This was a man who held my career in his hands, who had the power to destroy everything I had worked so hard to achieve. And now, he was holding my life in his hands as well. Emily remained on the floor, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her dress. Her eyes darted between Richard and me, as if she were trying to gauge who was more dangerous in that moment. I wanted to reach out to her, to pull her away from this nightmare, but the cold was a constant, looming threat that kept me rooted to the spot. Richard's voice cut through the silence, cold and unforgiving. You think you can just walk into your house and find your wife with another man, and everything will be fine? You think you can just walk away from this? He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that sent shivers down my spine. No, Michael. You're going to learn what it means to lose control. You're going to learn what it means to be powerless. His words were like a knife to the gut, each one twisting deeper into the wound. He was right. I had always prided myself on being in control, on being the one who made the decisions and called the shots. But now, all of that was being stripped away, piece by piece, by a man who reveled in his own cruelty. For a moment, I considered doing as he said, just standing there and letting him have his way. Maybe it would be easier that way, no confrontation, no violence, just a quiet submission to the inevitable. But as I looked at Emily, at the fear in her eyes, I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't just stand by and let this man destroy us both. My mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to turn the tables without getting us all killed. But every scenario I imagined ended the same way, with Richard's Colt going off and someone lying dead on the floor. The power he wielded over us in that moment was absolute, and he knew it. But then something unexpected happened. Emily, who had been silent and motionless up until now, suddenly spoke. Her voice was shaky, but there was a resolve in it that caught me off guard. Richard, please, she said, her eyes locked onto his. This isn't what we agreed to. You said no one would get hurt. For a moment, Richard's expression faltered, the smirk slipping as he turned his attention to her. Emily, don't be stupid, he snapped. You knew what this was. You knew the risks. But not like this, she insisted, her voice gaining strength. Not with a gun. This wasn't supposed to be about violence. I could see the conflict in Richard's eyes, the brief hesitation as he considered her words. It was a small crack in his otherwise impenetrable facade, but it was enough to give me hope. If I could just exploit that hesitation, if I could find a way to push him further off balance, maybe, just maybe, we could get out of this alive. Emily's right, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed, Richard. We can walk away from this. You can walk away from this. He turned back to me, the Colt still aimed squarely at my chest, but I could see the uncertainty creeping into his eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw a glimmer of doubt in his expression, a crack in the armor of his arrogance. You think you can talk your way out of this, Michael? He sneered, but the edge in his voice was gone, replaced by something closer to desperation. You think you can just walk away like nothing happened? No, I admitted, my heart pounding. But I think you can. You don't have to do this, Richard. You don't have to cross this line. For a long moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Richard's hand wavered slightly, the Colt dipping just enough to show that he was considering my words. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give me a sliver of hope. But that hope was short-lived. In an instant, Richard's expression hardened again, the doubt replaced by cold, steely resolve. He had made up his mind. You're wrong, Michael, he said, his voice deadly calm. I do have to do this, because if I don't, you'll never understand what it means to lose, and I can't let that happen. Before I could react, he reached down with his free hand and grabbed Emily by the hair, yanking her to her feet with a cruel, jerking motion. She cried out in pain, her hands flying up to his wrist as she tried to pry his fingers from her scalp. But Richard was unrelenting, his grip like a vice as he pulled her closer to him. Richard, stop, I shouted, my voice breaking with desperation. The sight of him manhandling Emily, the woman I had loved and cherished, ignited a primal fury within me. But the Colt was still there, a stark reminder of the deadly consequences of acting on that fury. I was trapped in a nightmare, forced to watch as Richard asserted his dominance in the most brutal way possible. Emily's eyes were wide with terror, her body trembling as Richard pressed the cold metal of the gun against her temple. The scene was surreal, like something out of a movie, a dark, twisted scene that I couldn't escape from. My mind raced, searching for any way out of this, any way to stop what was about to happen. Please, Richard, Emily whimpered, tears streaming down her cheeks. You don't have to do this. Let's just stop. We can pretend this never happened. But Richard wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on mine, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and sadistic pleasure. He was enjoying this, the power, the fear, the control. This was about more than just a twisted desire. It was about teaching me a lesson, about breaking me in a way that I would never recover from. Michael, he said, his voice dripping with venom, you need to understand something. In this world, there are winners and losers, and you, my friend, are about to learn what it means to lose. With that, he shoved Emily toward me, the sudden force of his movement sending her stumbling into my arms. I caught her instinctively, my heart hammering in my chest as I held her close. But the relief of having her in my arms was short-lived. Richard's smirk returned as he raised the Colt once more, this time aiming it directly at my head. This is your last chance, Michael, he said coldly. Stand there and watch, or I'll put a bullet in your skull. And trust me, I won't lose any sleep over it. Time seemed to freeze as I stared down the barrel of the gun. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and rage, but underneath it all was a crushing sense of helplessness. Richard was right. He held all the cards, and there was nothing I could do to change that. If I moved, if I tried to fight back, he would kill me. And then what would happen to Emily? Would he kill her too? Or would he keep her alive, a twisted trophy of his conquest? I couldn't let that happen. No matter how much I wanted to tear him apart, I knew I had to play this carefully. I had to find a way to de-escalate the situation, to protect Emily without provoking Richard any further. Okay, I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. You win, Richard. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't hurt her. Please. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but I forced them out, praying that it would be enough to placate him. I could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the twisted pleasure he took in my submission. He had won, and he wanted me to know it. For a moment, it seemed like he might lower the gun, like he might finally relent now that he had asserted his dominance. But then, with a chilling smile, he shook his head. No, Michael, he said softly. This isn't over. Not yet. And with that, he turned the gun back on Emily. Now, he said, his voice low and dangerous, you're going to do exactly as I say, or I'll make sure the last thing you see is her brains splattered all over this room. Emily's grip on my arm tightened, her body trembling against mine. I could feel her fear, her panic, radiating off her in waves. But there was nothing I could do except nod, my mind scrambling to find some way to get us out of this alive. What do you want? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Just tell me what you want, and I'll do it. Richard's smile widened, and I could see the gears turning in his mind as he considered his next move. He had already won the psychological battle, but now he wanted more. He wanted to drag this out, to savor every moment of our torment. Get on your knees, he ordered, the words like a slap to the face. I hesitated, my pride warring with my survival instincts, but the sight of the coal pressed against Emily's temple left me with no choice. Slowly, I lowered myself to the floor, the humiliation burning in my chest like a hot coal. Richard watched with satisfaction as I complied, his grip on the gun never wavering. Once I was on my knees, he took a step closer, his shadow looming over me like a dark cloud. Good, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Now beg. What? I choked out, my mind reeling. You heard me, he replied, his tone icy. Beg for her life. Beg for your life. I want to hear you grovel, Michael. I want to see you at your lowest, just like you made me feel every time you questioned my decisions at work, every time you thought you knew better than me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about Emily. This was about every slight, every disagreement, every moment where I had dared to challenge him at work. He was using this twisted scenario to settle old scores, to put me in my place once and for all, but there was no room for pride anymore. Not with Emily's life on the line. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced the words out. Please, Richard, I said, my voice cracking. Don't do this. I'm begging you. Just let her go. I'll do anything you want, just please don't hurt her. The satisfaction in his eyes was sickening, but I pushed down the disgust and kept going, knowing that my only chance was to keep him talking, to keep him distracted. Is this what you wanted? I continued, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. To see me broken? To see me at your mercy? Fine, you win, Richard. You've beaten me. Just please, let her go. I'll do whatever you want, just don't hurt her. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Richard's expression remained unreadable, the Colt still aimed at Emily's head. I held my breath, praying that my submission would be enough to satisfy his twisted need for control. But then, to my horror, Richard's smile widened even further, his eyes gleaming with malevolent delight. No, Michael, he said softly. This isn't about winning or losing anymore. This is about punishment, and you, both of you, deserve to be punished. With those words, he reached down and grabbed a fistful of Emily's hair, yanking her head back with a vicious jerk. She cried out in pain, her hands flying up to grasp at his wrist. But he didn't relent. The look in his eyes was pure, unadulterated cruelty. Richard, stop. I shouted, my voice hoarse with desperation. Please don't do this. But he ignored me, his focus entirely on Emily as he twisted her hair in his hand, forcing her to her knees beside me. The Colt was still in his other hand, the barrel now pressed against her cheek. This is what happens when you betray me, Michael, he hissed, his voice laced with venom. This is what happens when you think you can challenge me. You lose everything. Time seemed to slow as I watched in horror, my mind screamed for me to do something, anything to stop him. But there was nothing I could do. Richard held all the power, and he was using it to destroy everything I held dear. Please, I whispered, my voice breaking. Please don't hurt her. I'm begging you, Richard. But my pleas fell on deaf ears. Richard's smile twisted into something darker, something more sinister, as he leaned in close to Emily's ear, his voice a low, menacing whisper. Tell him, Emily, he said, his words dripping with malice. Tell them how much you wanted this. Tell them how much you wanted me. Emily's eyes were wide with terror, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at me, her lips trembling, but no words came out. The fear in her eyes was palpable, but it was more than just fear for herself. It was fear for me, for what I might do if she said what Richard wanted her to say. But Richard wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. He tightened his grip on her hair, pulling her head back even further, until she was forced to look up at him. "Say it," he commanded, his voice low and dangerous, "or I'll make sure Michael watches as I pull this trigger." Tears streamed down Emily's cheeks as she struggled to find her voice. I could see the torment in her eyes, the battle between self-preservation and the need to protect me. But in the end, self-preservation won out. I wanted it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wanted you." The words hit me like a sledgehammer, knocking the air out of my lungs. I felt like the ground had opened up beneath me, swallowing me whole. This was the final, crushing blow, the one that shattered any remaining hope I had of salvaging our lives, our marriage, our dignity. The words Emily whispered, "I wanted you," echoed in my mind like a death knell, reverberating in the hollow space where my heart had once been. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built my life around, was kneeling before me, confessing her betrayal in a voice so broken it barely felt like her own. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the desperation, and I knew she had spoken those words under duress. Richard had forced her hand, and now he was forcing mine. Richard's twisted smile widened as he saw the devastation in my eyes. He relished in the destruction he had wrought, knowing that he had broken me in the most personal way possible. But in his arrogance, he made a mistake. He underestimated the depth of my resolve. He thought he had crushed me completely, that there was nothing left but a hollow shell. But he was wrong. Beneath the pain, beneath the horror of what I had just witnessed, a fire was burning, an all-consuming rage that threatened to erupt at any moment. Richard, still holding Emily by the hair, leaned in close to her ear. "See, Michael," he taunted, his voice dripping with cruelty. "She wanted this. She wanted me. You were never enough for her. You were just a stepping stone, a placeholder until something better came along. And now, she's mine." Emily's eyes were filled with tears, her body trembling in his grip. I could see the conflict within her, the guilt, the shame, the fear, but I also saw the glimmer of something else. It was a silent plea, a desperate hope that I could somehow find a way to end this nightmare. But as I looked into her eyes, I knew that hope was fading fast. Richard's words were like gasoline on the fire burning within me. I could feel the anger bubbling up, threatening to explode. But I had to keep it in check, at least for a little while longer. I had to bide my time, wait for the right moment. If I moved too soon, if I acted on impulse, it would be the end for both of us. Richard, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me, turned his attention back to me. "You're pathetic, Michael," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look at you, groveling at my feet like a dog. Did you really think you could compete with me? Did you really think you could keep a woman like Emily satisfied? You're nothing. You're weak. And now, you're going to watch as I take everything from you." I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to remain still, to keep my emotions in check, but every fiber of my being screamed for action, for retribution. I knew I had to act soon, but I also knew that any rash move would be the end of us both. I needed a plan, a way to turn the tables without getting us killed. And then, as if the universe had heard my silent plea, an opportunity presented itself. In his arrogance, Richard made a critical error. He loosened his grip on the Colt. It was just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to give me an opening. My eyes flicked to the gun, calculating the distance, the time it would take for me to close the gap. It was a risk, a huge one, but it was the only chance I had. If I could disarm him, even for a moment, I might be able to turn the tide. "Richard," I said, my voice steady despite the raging storm inside me. "You're right, I'm weak. I've always been weak. But I can't watch this anymore. Please, just end it. End it now, and I'll do whatever you want." My words were a ruse, a distraction to keep his focus on me while I prepared to make my move. I could see the satisfaction in his eyes, the twisted pleasure he took in my supposed submission. He thought he had won, that I was completely at his mercy. But as he smirked down at me, I tensed, readying myself for what had to be done. The moment Richard opened his mouth to respond, I sprang into action. With every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged at him, my hand aiming for the Colt. The element of surprise was on my side. Richard hadn't expected me to fight back, hadn't expected me to have any fight left in me. My fingers closed around the barrel of the gun, and in that instant, I knew it was now or never. The struggle was fierce, brutal. Richard was stronger than I had anticipated, and he fought with a ferocity born of desperation. But I was fueled by something more powerful, a primal need to protect, to avenge, to end this nightmare once and for all. We grappled for control of the Colt, the cold metal slipping between our fingers as we struggled on the floor. Emily was screaming, her voice a distant echo in the chaos. I could feel Richard's grip tightening, could see the madness in his eyes as he realized he was losing control, but I couldn't afford to lose focus. One wrong move, one lapse in concentration, and it would be over. I had to end this, and I had to end it now. With a final desperate surge of strength, I twisted the gun in Richard's hand, forcing the barrel away from Emily and myself. There was a deafening crack as the Colt discharged, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly in the wall, but the shock of the gunshot gave me the opening I needed. With a guttural roar, I wrenched the gun from Richard's hand and brought the butt of the Colt down on his head. Richard's eyes widened in shock, and then, with a low groan, he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The silence that followed was deafening, the only sound the ragged breathing of Emily and myself. For a moment, I just stood there, the Colt still clutched in my hand, staring down at Richard's motionless body. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, my heart hammering in my chest as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Emily was the first to move. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at Richard's prone form. Is he dead?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, though I wasn't entirely sure. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "But he's out cold. We need to get out of here. Now." Emily nodded, still in a daze, and I quickly made my way to her, pulling her into my arms. For a moment, we just stood there, holding each other, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on us both. But there was no time to dwell on it. We needed to leave, to put as much distance between ourselves and Richard as possible before he regained consciousness. "Come on," I said, gently guiding her toward the door. "We need to go." But Emily hesitated, her eyes flicking back to Richard's body. "What about him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I followed her gaze, my mind racing. There was no way we could leave him here. If he woke up, he would come after us. And with the Colt still in my hand, the temptation to end it all right then and there was overwhelming. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't cross that line, no matter how much he deserved it. "We'll call the police," I said, my voice firm. "But we need to get out of here first. It's not safe." Emily nodded, the resolve in her eyes hardening. She knew I was right, and without another word, we turned and fled the house, leaving Richard lying unconscious on the floor. The drive was a blur, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Emily sat beside me silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Neither of us spoke, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavily in the air. I could still feel the cold metal of the Colt in my hand. The image of Richard's twisted smile burned into my mind. But there was no time to dwell on it. We had to focus on what came next. When we finally pulled into the driveway of a small motel on the outskirts of town, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The place was run down, the neon sign flickering ominously in the dim light, but it was safe, for now at least. "We'll stay here tonight," I said, turning to Emily. "In the morning, we'll figure out what to do." Emily nodded, her eyes dull with exhaustion. She looked like she was barely holding it together, the events of the night taking a toll on her that was impossible to ignore. But there was no time for rest, not yet. We needed to make a plan, to figure out how to deal with the aftermath of what had just happened. Inside the motel room, the tension was palpable. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while I paced the floor, my mind racing. The Colt was still tucked into my waistband, a grim reminder of the night's events. "We can't go to the police," Emily said suddenly, her voice startling me out of my thoughts. I stopped pacing, turning to look at her. "What do you mean?" "We have to. Richard, they'll come after us if we don't." But Emily shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, Michael, you don't understand. Richard isn't just some angry colleague. He has connections, powerful ones. If we go to the police, they might not believe us, or worse, they might be on his side. He could spin this to make us look like the aggressors. We'd be trapped." Her words hit me like a cold slap of reality. Richard's influence had always been something I dismissed, but now it loomed like a dark cloud over everything. If what Emily said was true, then we were in far deeper trouble than I'd initially thought. Going to the police could backfire catastrophically, leaving us exposed and vulnerable. My thoughts raced, trying to find another way out of this nightmare. "We need to disappear," Emily continued, her voice shaky but determined. "At least for a while, until we figure out our next move. We can't trust anyone right now." The idea of running, of abandoning everything we'd known, filled me with dread. But as I looked into Emily's eyes, I realized there was no other option. The fear in her gaze was all too real, and it mirrored my own. We were on our own, and the only way to survive was to vanish, to leave no trace behind. I nodded slowly, the weight of our decision settling heavily on my shoulders. "You're right," I said quietly. "We need to go somewhere Richard can't reach us, somewhere we can regroup and figure out our next steps." Emily exhaled, relief washing over her features, but the relief was short-lived. The reality of our situation was sinking in for both of us. We were about to abandon our lives, to become fugitives in a world that suddenly felt hostile and unforgiving. "First, we need to get rid of the car," I said, my mind already working through the logistics. "It's too easy to trace. We'll get a burner phone, some cash, and head to a place where no one knows us." Emily nodded, but I could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. The night had taken its toll on her, and I knew we were running on borrowed time. But there was no room for rest, not yet. Not until we were far away from Richard's reach. We left the motel under the cover of darkness, taking only what we could carry. The car we'd driven in, our last tie to our old lives, was abandoned in a parking lot miles away, the keys left inside. It was a symbolic gesture as much as a practical one, a way of severing our ties to everything we'd known. From there, we moved like shadows, slipping through the cracks of the world. We bought a cheap, second-hand car with cash and drove aimlessly for hours, putting as much distance between ourselves and Richard as possible. The landscape blurred past us, a dark void that mirrored the uncertainty of our future. Days turned into weeks as we moved from place to place, never staying long enough to leave a trace. We became ghosts, living on the fringes, always looking over our shoulders, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. It was a life of constant vigilance, of unrelenting fear, and yet in the quiet moments when the world seemed far away, there was a strange sense of peace. We had each other, and in the midst of all the chaos, that was the only thing that felt real. But the peace was fleeting. The longer we stayed hidden, the more the weight of our actions pressed down on us. The guilt, the fear, the uncertainty, they were constant companions, haunting our every step, and beneath it all, there was the lingering question of what would happen if Richard found us. The fear of retribution, of what he might do if he caught up to us, was always there, lurking in the shadows. As the weeks passed, our funds dwindled, and the reality of our situation became impossible to ignore. We couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, we would have to confront the demons we'd been fleeing from. But how? And at what cost? One night, as we sat in a dingy motel room in a small, forgotten town, the weight of everything finally came crashing down. Emily had been quiet for most of the evening, lost in her thoughts. I could see the toll it was taking on her, the sleepless nights, the constant fear, the guilt that had burrowed deep into her soul. She was a shell of the woman she had once been, and it broke my heart to see her like this. "I can't do this anymore, Michael," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't keep running, it's killing me." I turned to her, my heart aching. "Emily, we don't have a choice. If we stop, if we let our guard down, Richard will find us, and you know what he'll do." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "But what kind of life is this? Living in fear, always looking over our shoulders. We've lost everything, our home, our friends, our lives. I don't even know who I am anymore." I reached out to take her hand, but she pulled away, the pain in her eyes cutting deep. "We need to end this, Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to face Richard, to put a stop to this once and for all." The thought of confronting Richard again sent a chill down my spine. But as I looked at Emily, at the broken woman before me, I knew she was right. We couldn't keep running forever. Sooner or later, we would have to face the monster that had torn our lives apart. And if we were going to survive, we needed to do it on our terms. But how? Richard had power, influence, resources we could only dream of. Going after him head-on would be suicide. We needed a plan, something that would give us an advantage, something that would turn the tables in our favor. As the night wore on, we talked, our voices low and hushed as we formulated a plan. It was risky, dangerous, and there were a million ways it could go wrong, but it was the only option we had left. We would confront Richard, but not as the broken, desperate people he had tried to turn us into. We would face him with a strength born from our shared struggle, our shared pain. The next day, we set our plan into motion. It took every ounce of courage we had left, every bit of resolve we could muster. We tracked down the people who had worked with Richard, those who had been wronged by him in the past. Slowly, carefully, we began to build a case against him, gathering evidence of his misdeeds, his corruption, his ties to the underworld. It was dangerous work, and there were moments when I feared we wouldn't make it out alive. But we pressed on, knowing that this was our only chance to end the nightmare. Finally, after weeks of painstaking work, we had enough. Enough to expose Richard for what he truly was, enough to bring him down. The day of reckoning had arrived, and as we stood on the precipice of our final confrontation, I felt a strange sense of calm. This was it, the moment that would determine our fate. We arranged to meet Richard in a secluded location, a place where we would have the upper hand. As we waited for him to arrive, the tension was palpable. Emily stood beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly, the fear in her eyes matched only by her determination. When Richard finally arrived, he was alone, just as we had instructed, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't there to talk. He was there to end this, one way or another. "I see you finally grown a spine, Michael," he sneered as he approached, his eyes flicking to Emily. "And you, Emily, I'm disappointed. I thought you'd have more sense than to follow this fool to your doom." But there was no fear in Emily's eyes now, only resolve. "This ends today, Richard," she said, her voice steady. "You've taken everything from us, but you won't take our lives. We have proof of everything, your connections, your crimes. It's over." Richard's eyes narrowed, and I could see the gears turning in his mind as he calculated his next move. But before he could act, I pulled out the phone we had prepared, showing him the evidence we had gathered. "If anything happens to us, this goes public," I said, my voice firm. "Your empire will crumble, and you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. You can't silence us anymore." For the first time, I saw fear flicker in Richard's eyes. He knew we had him cornered, and there was no way out. But instead of lashing out, he surprised us both by smiling. A cold, calculating smile. "You've won this round," he said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual venom. "But don't think for a second that this is over. You may have delayed the inevitable, but I will find a way to make you pay. And when I do, you won't see it coming." With those final words, Richard turned and walked away, leaving us standing there in the silence. The confrontation was over, but the war was far from won. We had bought ourselves time, but we knew Richard wouldn't give up so easily. The threat he left hanging in the air was as real as the evidence we held against him. But as I turned to Emily, seeing the strength and determination in her eyes, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. We had been through hell and back, but we had survived. And as long as we had each other, we would find a way to keep surviving. As we left the scene, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift, replaced by a cautious hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was a road we would walk together, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way out of the darkness.